right, so, funny story about the title of this talk. I proposed this talk, I think, in February of this year, and then I gave another talk, which is now one of my more popular talks, and it's about fanaticism in JavaScript and why it's a problem and why it affects software development and how it affects software development. And then I realized the title of the second talk and the title of the first talk don't exactly, coexist peacefully. And so I decided to scrap that name, but it was a little late. So the real name of this talk is why I use Flight and why you should consider it too. So a little bit about me. I'm a JavaScript addict. Node front-end robotics. I am on the NodeBots core team. I am NodeBotanist on Twitter. I can be reached at cass@nodebots.io. There's a pattern here. I'm an engineering evangelist at Retail Me Not. It's a little different from a dev evangelist, but I still do a lot of development. You can ask me what it means later. And yes, I do have a GIF problem. I'm just not willing to accept it yet. So what is Flight? Flight is a lightweight component-based JavaScript framework. You stopped reading by now. Because you're already thinking, but I'm a fan of Angular or Backbone or Ember or React or whatever. And I'm about to drop some opinions on you. And if you disagree with those opinions, it's perfectly okay. I think a lot of frameworks are overused and truly shoehorned into applications where they're not exactly the right tool for the job. I have seen a lot of people doing what I call fighting the framework. And what I mean by that is writing more code than you are saving by using a framework, fighting that framework, and writing plugins for that framework, and writing around the things for that framework. And I truly question the reward-to-work ratio of a lot of today's modern frameworks because they take so long to get ramped up in to write non-trivial applications in that it's weird how much work you put into it for how much reward you get. And I know a lot of people who probably disagree with this opinion. A lot of people have their favorite framework and they say, well, maybe the other frameworks are like that, but not my framework, not Angular, not Ember, not whatever. But we have a serious problem with framework fanaticism. In JavaScript, it's kind of, in client-side JavaScript, it's kind of recent because really we didn't really have frameworks in client-side JavaScript until recently. But just like every other language that has frameworks, we now have this fanaticism issue where everybody is sticking to theirs and they don't want to try new things. They don't want to accept that there are other solutions, and they have the hammer-nail problem of when you have a hammer, everything's a nail. So what we need to start asking when we look at new tools, new frameworks, is not how is this new framework my favorite framework? We should ask ourselves, how will this make my JavaScript better? What can I learn from this framework? Even if I'm not going to use it, what practices can I take back to my own development? Again, a lot of people probably disagree with this opinion, and if you do, feel free to find me at the happy hour or any of the the free-form events. I'm not hard to spot. So, just come find me. So, I'm going to start talking about truly what Flight is with the definition of the word framework. And the definition of the word framework contains the following: an essential supporting structure of a building, vehicle, or object. Note, essential supporting structure. Not anything else, just the essentials. So Flight is a framework in that sense. It is a remarkably small piece of code. It's 5 kilobytes minified in gzip. Not a large piece of code. Does not do a lot for you, but what it does is very poignant, and what it does is very good for your application building. Flight is not overly prescriptive. I have found a lot of frameworks to be very, very prescriptive, borderline overly prescriptive. Flight is not. It's not MV Star unless you write it to be MV Star. It plays well with other libraries and actually incorporates code from other libraries really easily, and I'll go into that in a little bit. And it gives you tools to structure your code. It doesn't tell you how to architect your code. It gives you tools to structure that architecture a little more reusably, a little more maintainably. So there are a couple commandments of Flight. I know I just said it's not opinionated, but they're relatively few, and I find they're kind of hard to disagree with. Components are atomic. They're completely self-sufficient, and they're completely their own pieces of code. They have dependencies, obviously, but once you've packaged a component, you're not cross-dependencing anything, and you're not going to be referencing it terribly much either. Communication is done via events. Once you instantiate a component, you can no longer directly reference that component. The only way you can affect change to that component is by firing events that it listens to. So you're not messing around with each and every little instantiation of a component. You're simply sending it out in the wild. It listens for events and responds to them like you programmed it to. Using the DOM, there's a lot of DOM hating going around in client-side JavaScript. It can be slow, but if done correctly and if you just pay attention to what you're doing, I find that using the DOM is not really all that terrifyingly slow. And the fourth commandment is test everything. Flight is the easiest front-end framework I've had to test ever. It's remarkably easy to test, and we'll actually go into that a little bit as well. So one of the core pieces that Flight gives you is the concept of functional mix-ins in JavaScript. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those in case you've never heard of them. So what a functional mix-in does is it applies functionality to a prototype. It's not an object that you augment a prototype with. It's a process that you apply pieces of functionality to a prototype with. Angus Kroll has written a lot about functional mix-ins, and you should definitely check out his writing on the subject. And to me, it's the best thing to happen to JS since JSKit. I really think it works well with the language, especially because what you're applying is generic, reusable functionality. When you write a mix-in, you want to write it as generically as possible because you want to be able to reuse it, and you're just applying functionality to new prototypes. It highly favors the Gang of Four's prediction that composition over inheritance is going to be is definitely an interesting design pattern, and I happen to agree with it, and so does this guy. Again, the Gang of Four says composition over inheritance. One interesting part for me in inheritance is one time I was digging around code, and I found a sign up button that inherited from sign up form element, and then sign up form element inherited from button, but I was trying to make a sign up text field. So now I have this inheritance chain that I have to break in order to reuse this particular piece of code, and I ended up just throwing it out and rewriting it, of course, being a young developer who knows better than everyone else. I really think JS is not built for inheritance, and again, opinion that you can find me and talk to me about if you really want to. I happen to agree with Angus. We just need to stop trying emulating classical inheritance in a language with prototypes with the ability to do these compositional object construction. We don't really need to force ourselves to use classical inheritance. So you can follow along at GitHub. That link actually is probably from the last study of this talk. I modified the slides a bunch, but there's a link to the code in the conference repo. So MidwestJS/2014, and then under why you should be using Flight. Okay, so I'm going to go over the steps, and I'm going to show you the sample application that I wrote. So the first step is just to write your HTML. Note, there's nothing weird, really, about this HTML. There's no extra attributes. I could have some data attributes, but I didn't choose to add them. Just a couple classes that point out JS. I like to do that, so that way when I'm doing CS and JS separately, I'm not deleting classes that will affect functionality. And that's it. It's just regular HTML. So step 2 is to write your component code. This is, just besides the first 3 lines and the last 2 lines, this is everything in the component. So the 4 parts are the this.attributes call, the this.after initialize call, event handlers, which go within this.after, and the component definition and mix-ins are your final piece of line. This is what you return from your module. So when I talk about component definition and mix-ins, this is how you define your component, and we talked about functional mix-ins. The way you apply them in Flight is when you define your component, you pass the mix-ins in, and then you pass your component in last. The reason you do this is you want your most generic code to go first and your most specific code to go last, because the second one will override the first, the third one will override the second. Basically, you're overriding down. And you want your mix-ins to be generic, you want your component to be specific. So that's why it's in that order. So as for actually using a component, you require it in. It uses AMD. They're working on a browserify version. And so when you require in your constructor, and you attach it to HTML nodes. So we'll, again, go into this a little bit. And you can override your attributes when you attach it to a function or to an HTML node. And we'll talk to why that's a good idea as well. So in fact, we'll talk about that now. So you can override your selectors by making them attributes of the component. And the reason you want to do that is because when you want to instantiate the component on a different piece of HTML, all you have to do is pass in new selectors. You don't have to rewrite the component code. You don't even have to touch the component code. You just pull the component down, give it the selectors it needs to attach to, and let it go. Makes it reusable among several HTML fixtures. So I'm going to explain how events are handled in components before I show you all the demo code, and I've accompanied it with some very funny / cute critter gifs to explain what's going on. So all instances of a component within event scope react to the same events. So in this case, all of the kittens are reacting to the toy or food or whatever it is behind that camera that's falling. In this case, this variable within any event handler in flight is referring to the instance of the component that the event has been triggered on. So you have access to your instance of the component within the component code via this. This is an interesting pattern I've seen, and it's people throwing errors when there's a problem. Instead of using like bubbling up like throwing, they'll use Flight's actual event system to fire an event, an error event, and then handle it from there. It's an interesting pattern. And then I'm going to go over the demo code real quick. Alright, so I'm going to show you what it does first. So, got a page. Oh, you're kidding me. Oh. Alright, so we got a page full of counters. They each react differently. They're all the same component. And then I have two components up top. One is incrementing all the counters, and one decrements all the counters. That's the application that I built. And wow, this resolution is really going to mess with me today. I'm going to hide the... Okay. So I'm going to take a look at my, just my root JavaScript, as I like to call it. So just requiring in my components, my counter and my change all. Notice my increment all and decrement all button is actually the same Flight component. We're just modifying some attributes in order to make it decrement instead of increment. So then in the main function, I'm telling the counter to attach to all instances of the class JS counter. So you give it basically a CSS selector, and it will attach to all instances of that selector. So keep that in mind. And then I told change all to attach to the increment all and decrement all buttons. In the second decrement all button, I'm passing an object. When you pass an object as the second parameter, it overrides the default attribute of that component with the new ones. So in this case, it's overriding increment to be false. So first we're going to take a look at the counter component. So, let's see. Okay, cool. All right, so requiring and define component is just basically Flight saying, okay, this is how I construct a component out of your code. And with number text is one of my mix-ins. I will show you the mix-in in a moment. So I return define component, like I said, you use your mix-ins first because they're generic, and then you return your component as the last argument. And then we're going to go into the actual function for the component. So this default attributes, this is code based on Flight 1.1. 1.2 is this attributes instead of this default atters, so keep that in mind. And then these are my selectors. So when I say counter display, I want the class JS count. When I want increment button, JS increment. And this is what I mean by overriding your HTML selectors. If I want to declare counter on a different piece of HTML, I would just pass an object with different classes for these properties, and it would attach to a different piece of HTML without me having to modify the component code. So after initialize is fired once the component is on the DOM, is attached, and is ready to start listening for events. So that's usually where you put your event listeners and your event handlers. So I'm saying on click of the increment button, I want to increment. On click of decrement, I want to decrement. On counter change, I want change fire. This is how I update my display. And then on document, increment all and decrement all, this dot increment and this dot decrement. So that's how it's listening for the big button up top. I want to split this out into a mix-in. I just did not have time when I wrote this morning. All right, so the increment and decrement functions are just basically preventing default because I used blinks. I should just use buttons. Current value equals the get number value of counter display, which is in the mix-in. I'll show that in a moment. And then triggering a counter change with the value +1. And then the change just basically changes the text display of the counter. So for the mix-in, so a mix-in looks an awful lot like a component. It can even have its own default attributes. It has its own this dot after initialize method, and then you can just extend it the way you want to. So a mix-in is essentially a small component that's just bound to be reused. You can instantiate it on your own in 1.2 actually. There is no difference between a mix-in and a component other than a few utility classes given to mix-ins. So what I'm saying is when I want to get the number value, I want to selector, which means I need to pass in a selector to this function, and I want the text to 9 is 0. So I want the actual number value of the text input, of the text field on the component. So this doesn't return define component, whatever, it just returns with number text. That's the difference between a mix-in and a component. The component would return define component with all of the stuff in it. You can mix in mix-ins. So I could put a mix-in on this if I wanted to. I would do the same thing except define mix-in, my original mix-in, comma, this mix-in. I know that got confusing. But anyway, what else is there to show? I think that's it. The tests, but I haven't gotten to that yet. Okay. Awesome. Whoa. Okay, slides. We're going to have to talk about those. Why? Oh, yeah, there we go. So, and it went all the way back to the beginning because, that's what I wanted. Yeah, Firefox. Right. Oh, it's good to go back. So like I said, Flight is actually the easiest framework I've ever tested. And the reason for this is pretty simple to me. So you've got a component and it's completely atomic. It doesn't, it's not a dependency of anything usually. And when you test it, all you have to do are fire events and wait for other events to fire. So if I fire event A with data B, I know event C with data D is going to happen every time. So it makes these pretty easy to test even for front-end code. I know front-end JavaScript is usually ridiculously hard to test because there's DOM dependencies, there's event dependencies. Luckily, Flight provides a full testing framework for itself, which is pretty nice. It works with Karma, it works with Phantom.js, it works, I forgot asterisk. It does not work with version 1.2 because they use bind, and Phantom.js is about as bad as IE6 and does not support bind, so it actually does not work in Phantom.js right now without ES5 shim and sham, which don't work in Karma. So 1.2 does not work in Karma except in Chrome, so they're working on that. Jasmine Flight and Mocha Flight are the two libraries that they provide, and I'll show what they provide in just a second. I have the Yeoman app generator struck out because 1.2 only launched a couple weeks ago. They haven't quite updated their Yeoman generator to reflect 1.2's changes. If they don't do it by Saturday, I'm probably going to do it. Anyway, so what do Jasmine Flight and Mocha Flight do? They give you event spies, automatic HTML markup injection, and headless test running. Again, for 1.1, working on 1.2. So this is a Mocha Flight test, which you probably can't read because it's a little small. So it looks pretty much like a standard Mocha test suite. You've got before each, you've got the it, you've got the expects. I'm missing a parenthesis there. So the only difference is the setup component call. And what this does is I'm passing it a piece of arbitrary HTML. It's just going to inject that into the DOM for me so I can set up my component without having to mess with Mocha's runner's DOM. It just handles it for you. The event spies are pretty nice. I'm pretty sure it's just a shim of Sign-On.js, but it's a much easier to use shim of Sign-On.js. So I'm basically watching on document for counter change, and I'm testing that it will increment when the increment button is clicked. You have quick events, so I'm clicking the increment button on my little setup here. And then I'm expecting the event spy to have been triggered on document, so I'm basically saying there should have been a counter change event on document. And expect the spy's most recent call data to have a value of 1. Because the counter is initialized with 0, when I click the increment button, the counter should have a value of 1. So, now I'm going to show... Okay, I see what you did there. Alright. Completely out of full screen mode. Alright, so my tests are hiding behind... Okay, so these are the tests again. I have more than just the one I showed on the slide. I have two. great test coverage there. I have increment and decrement, and I have a should be defined just to make sure that everything's working. I fell into a pit testing these two. They were both failing, and I'm like, why are they failing? It turns out the component wasn't registering, and so I added that test as kind of like a sanity check of like, oh, okay, so the component's working. So I'm going to run these. The Yeoman generator gives you the npm test command with Karma set up. Again, it does not work in Phantom.js because Phantom.js does not have bind. So I'm running it in Chrome, which is the only thing I use Chrome for nowadays. Karma test running. I forgot to hit start on screen recording. Sorry. Do you want me to hit it now, or do you want me to do it? Okay. I just saw the big red button, and I'm like, I forgot to press that button. Anyway, so I ran the test in Chrome, succeeded. So really, the only downside to testing with Flight in 1.2 is you can't use Phantom.js. You have Chrome pop up on your desktop for half a second or however long your test takes to run. So I really don't think that's a huge downside. It's a downside for Team City, but it's not a huge downside when you're testing on your desktop. So, way early. You're not terribly early. Alright. Really? Whatever. You can see my toolbar. Big deal. So not only does Flight give you the tools to test your code, it encourages you to write testable code by telling you to write these modules in a way that you do not need to access them in order to test them. All you need to do is fire events and listen for other events. And so it definitely makes it easier to test. And I really enjoy the fact that they seem to write new APIs for Flight with testability in mind. They do TDD, so they write their own tests first before writing the rest of the framework. It's kind of nice to see someone actually stick with TDD. I lasted a whole 5 minutes the last time. I was like, I'm going to do TDD from now on. Lasted 5 minutes. So anyway. So you're probably thinking, but I still like whatever better. That's cool, because Flight plays really, really well with other libraries. The way we implemented Flight at Retell Me Not was very slow. We have a website that reaches 10 billion views a year. We cannot take the website down for any reason, and we certainly can't put half a development team on rewriting all the JavaScript for the site for any period of time. We just can't do it. We need to ship new stuff. So the way we did it was we implemented Flight piecemeal because it worked so well with other pieces of code, and then slowly converted the rest of the application over, which actually worked out pretty well. 85% of our code is now Flight. This is actually a coworker right before we started moving to Flight. He actually complained of moving, but moving frameworks is hard with the childish whining voice and everything. And I'm going to give you a secret, and that is the super difficult, super complicated plan for moving your code to Flight. And that's it. This is it. Put event handlers in your code, put event triggers in your code. And no matter what framework you're using, you have access to event listeners, you have access to event triggers. You could be using frameworkless JavaScript, Angular, anything, any JavaScript code, you have access to these things. So it's really easy to just write a Flight component, stick it in your application, and have your other code interact with it. Because all you have to do is listen for and fire events. So Flight really likes developers, I think, because of the way it makes it testable. It's really easy to sell product on testing when you tell them it's only going to take a certain amount of time, or you tell them, look, we already have the tools we need to test, so it's not going to be that difficult. It really helps to sell product on writing tests. And again, because you can piecemeal, my boss describes it in the worst way. It's like a little parasite, and you kind of like put it in your code, and then it just slowly like eats the code around it and turns it into Flight, which is a parasite's a bad word for it. I think it's more like a symbiotic relationship. But anyway, I'm going on a tangent. The thing I like most about Flight is there is almost no real investment to getting started with Flight. If you know how a callback works and you know how event handlers work, you can use Flight. And I saw the funniest thing the other day. I volunteer at my alma mater, and I went back to the CS program, and a bunch of students come running up to me, and they go, what framework do I need to learn to get a job? And I was stunned. That's not the question we should have them asking. The question we should have them asking is, what skills should I learn? I would say learn, as much as I personally don't use promises, but go learn promises. Go learn generators. Go look up ES6 stuff, because that's what you're going to be using when you graduate. Not Ember, Angular, whatever, Flight even. I wouldn't even tell them Flight. I would just say, no, we'll learn these skills. When we have such a fanaticism for frameworks, that students who aren't even web developers yet think they need to pick a framework for life. And it's, no, you don't need to tattoo the Angular logo on your back to get a job. It's silly. It's remarkably interesting to me watching students think that when really they need to be thinking about JavaScript rather than a framework. And again, I love testing front-end JavaScript, in case that hasn't become clear by the fact that I have like 5 slides and GIFs attributed to it. We have enough chaos as it is, as web developers. Servers go down. APIs that we use go in and out of beta, go in and out of closed beta, go in and out of being free. Like, we have such a large amount of chaos around us that it's nice to be able to relegate some of that chaos by testing our front-end code. And having a framework that does make that easy makes your life a little easier, a lot easier in some cases. And all of this is because developer happiness is contagious. Our team has, granted, we were framework less, and then we went to Flight, so I think our happiness curve was a little steeper than moving from one framework to another, because we went from absolutely no organization to, okay, we've got these components, and they work like this, and oh, you can reuse my code because I've already written this. So, developer happiness tends to be contagious. When your team is working together, and they can read each other's code, and we're all speaking the same language, everything's pretty happy. So, any questions? That's the repo the code is in. My slides, again, are linked through the conference repository. I am Node Botanist on Twitter. This is the only funny joke I've ever made, so I had to make it at my Twitter handle. And you can reach me at cass@nodebots.io. And yeah, that's it. Thanks.